Yeah, potentially. To the people, the gracious people in the chat, did you miss out everything that everyone said but me? I think so. Okay. Well, maybe we should rewind a little bit. Okay. Thank you, Samuel. Thank you for hanging in there.
All right, let's do some just quick introductions then. Is that all right?
Yeah.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Corinna. I am the secretary for GCCAN. I've been involved since we started last fall, and I started transition back in the early 90s, and basically on and off through that whole time, I've struggled to get adequate healthcare. And so that's my main interest in GCCAN, is to, one, try to improve the level of care that as gender care consumer I receive, and two, to help other people have better information to be able to make better informed choices about their own healthcare. Grace B, do you want to go next?
Sure. So my name is Grace Branham. I'm currently functioning as treasurer of GCCAN. I joined the board, I believe around February, around the beginning of the year. And my interest in GCCAN, my personal history, I identified as transgender as a teenager. I was diagnosed with gender identity disorder at the age of 15. I very quickly began hormone replacement therapy at 16, which continued for about 4.5, 5 years. And I actually had a double mastectomy before I turned 18 while still in high school at the age of 17. And I detransitioned in my early 20s. And so part of my interest in GCCAN arises both from, I think, similar experiences in being dissatisfied with the care that I did receive, and also wishing that I had a more holistic sort of approach taken to my gender dysphoria, and then I had been given some alternatives in my toolkit, maybe, rather than medical and surgical intervention to process that dysphoria. And so I'm, very excited to be on board with GCCAN, doing what I think is important work, not just for detrans people and not just for transgender people, but for anyone who might access past, present, or future gender care services.
Yes. Thank you both. For reintroducing yourself, and I'm sure that you have heard plenty from me about myself. So, like I said, I think we were hoping to talk about the Bill of Rights, and if no one can hear Corinna and Grace's audio, then I think maybe we should just revisit Corinna's answer, if you don't mind, Corinna, of what you found compelling about the Bill of Rights. What's important to you?
The part of the Bill of Rights that calls out to me the most is there's a bullet that says we have the right to accurate medical information about the procedures we are considering. This information should include rates of complication, reversal options, and alternative approaches. And I would extend that and say that we also deserve to have some sort of long-term healthcare plan associated with any of the treatments that we receive. So in my case, going back to a surgery that I had many years ago, I wasn't really prepared by the surgeon to really understand or how to manage any sort of complications that might arise from it. Furthermore, my surgeon didn't have me work on any sort of local care plan. So my surgeon was out of state, and there weren't really any inquiries if I had a general care physician who could help me with any sort of immediate care issues that I had. Even considering that I'm now a lifelong HRT patient, I've only ever had one an endocrinologist try to help me build a sort of lifelong plan for what the care would look like. And unfortunately, I'm no longer with that endocrinologist because I moved to a different state. But I've had probably 4 or 5 endocrinologists since that person, and none of them really have ever tried to explain or warn what some of the health repercussions are of HRT. They just sign prescriptions and send me off. So that bullet point about helping gender care consumers be more informed about their choices is the one that resonates for me the most.
Thank you. Yeah, the lack of concern for long-term well-being in gender care patients is something that, you know, is a real concern just for people being able to live their lives in good health, I think. Grace Branham, would you like to comment on any part of the bill?
Yeah, first I want to respond just a little bit to what Karina was saying. I agree, and this actually wasn't something that I had thought a lot about, but when I had my surgery, I was also out of state, and there was also sort of that lack of continuity of care. There wasn't really any follow-up from the surgeon, and I was very lucky that I didn't have any complications, but the fact that if I did, I would have been sort of left to navigate that on my own. It seemed that there was this sort of mentality that I was lucky to be accessing that care in the first place. And so it was sort of just come in, get it done, and then get out. And the surgeon was moving on to the next patient very quickly. And so that, I think, is a very important area for improvement for gender care consumers. And I think the point about having information on long-term care and what that looks like really ties into the piece about research, which is probably the part of the bill that resonates most strongly with me. I believe the language is that we, as gender care consumers, we have the right to high quality, unbiased, longitudinal research tracking health and well-being throughout the lifespan for all past and present consumers. And as I'm a graduate student, and I'm entering the field myself, not medical research, but I really strongly believe in the importance of that unbiased research on gender care outcomes to help us plan for what that looks like for us. And it's been really disheartening for me to see sort of what I see as political or ideological motivations foreclosing the opportunity for this collection and analysis of data, which would enable us to live healthier lives. So if you look at what happened to James Caspian in the UK, where he was trying to do research on transgender desistance for his thesis, and his university shut it down because it was politically volatile. And just for me, as someone who gets a little fired up about higher ed and the university as an institution, that's something where I see really it's doing a disservice to consumers to not have that research being done. So I think that we really need to be advocating for and conducting, if we can, or if we're interested ourselves, research that's relevant to our lives and to our well-being.
Very well said, Grace. I think to build off both of your answers, if I could, I think there's something strange about, I guess, the lack of curiosity that seems to be incentivized about these sorts of things, about long-term outcomes, about desistance, which is again like a very politically charged topic, although I don't think it should be. It's it creates an environment that sets up a lot of people to not have optimal outcomes and to go for kind of, I don't know, I think to not be empowered as consumers making decisions about what's best for their body. In my experience, I think I can say that I had very ideologically informed doctors who were, pretty pushy, I would say, even about certain, I don't know, big decisions that I had to make, including transitional surgeries, which is something that, as you can imagine, I would end up wishing that I had gotten more information about and maybe felt more, I guess I would have liked providers to be a little more encouraging of more understanding of the symptoms that a patient is or a consumer is experiencing, and the kinds of outcomes that you're likely to realistically have from some of the interventions that are available. And I think to also speak on the lack of curiosity and the lack of long-term research being something that I think is important for the GCCAN Bill of Rights to address. I think that's really big, because I think that people are having experiences that are not great. People are either like detransitioning and not getting the kind of support that they need, or they are continuing trans healthcare and also not getting the kind of support that they need. And as someone who has gone back and talked to my doctor and had her kind of be like, well, I don't know what to tell you, that kind of attitude is really concerning, and I think not something that I like to see, especially when the field is kind of so experimental as it is with trans medicine. So I would say definitely those parts of the Bill of Rights are really important to me as well. Let's see. So I've got another question for us. I would like to ask, let's talk about an experience that we've had where we were unhappy with care that we received, but a way that it could be improved. And I think this may bleed over into what we talked about before, but maybe we could expand a little as well. Grace, would you like to start this time?
Sure. I actually had the opportunity, I don't know if we would call it an opportunity, to read back over some of my medical records, including my mental health records, when I was at my parents' recently. It was really astonishing. It was from when I was sort of right before I transitioned, 13, 14, 15 years old. And I started gender therapy at age 15. But this was on the heels, and this is something I guess I didn't forget it or bury it or anything like that, but it just wasn't where my head was at the time. But looking back over and realizing how close that beginning gender therapy was right on the heels of 3 inpatient psychiatric hospitalizations that had all occurred within the past year before I started gender therapy. And my previous therapist actually in her notes commented on sort of instability in identity and a tendency towards, self-destructive behavior. And these are records that my gender therapist received, I'm assuming, when my care was transferred, but I was green-lighted for hormones within 3 months. And so, this wasn't something that there wasn't really any substantive discussion that I remember with my gender therapist about my previous mental health. And there wasn't really an attempt to examine my motivations for transition. I will say before I was transferred to a gender specialist, I was seeing someone who didn't have any experience with trans patients. And she was not suspicious, but did sort of ask me, why do you want to do this? This seems very sudden. And then when I was resistant to that, she said, I can't do this. I don't have the specialty for this. I'm transferred. But the gender specialist didn't ask those questions. And so I will say, I think anyone who has had to sort of jump through the hoops to access gender care knows that there are things that you sort of have to say, or a narrative that you have to present. And that's what I did. But I do wish, and I think that my care would have been improved if there had just been digging a little bit deeper, especially coming in, at 15. Maybe if there had been more time sort of spent doing that work and really getting to the root of what my issue was, why I was in so much distress, and exploring different options for how to reduce that distress rather than just jumping into a medical solution. So that's probably, that's how I would say my care could have been improved at that age, at that time.
Thank you. Corinna, would you like to speak to an experience like that?
Well, it's interesting that Grace Branham talked about therapy in particular, because I have also had an experience where I've had a more difficult time connecting with a therapist over these issues. I needed to see a therapist about 5 years ago to deal with a grief of a very ill family member that I was experiencing, and I was needed to tap into tools to try to help manage that. And of course, it's always going to be the case that if you've transitioned, that's always going to be something that a therapist is going to have to talk through in order to try to figure out any other ways that you need help. And I didn't pick a therapist to talk about these issues. I was dealing with something else. But the therapist I ended up talking to had a very strong ideological bias about how I was supposed to deal with my own sense of being or identity. And although she wasn't that pushy, I found it really difficult to talk about the things that I needed to, because I was constantly having to defend the way that I saw myself. And I find that that's an ongoing issue of I'm really it's difficult for me to find a care provider right now who will help me deal with like the realistic effects of gender care, instead of the kind of the magic and unicorn type of viewpoint. I need somebody who will help me deal with the reality of things, and that's now more than ever has become a barrier to me getting care. So I would change that.
Thank you, Corinna. Wow, yeah, interesting perspectives on the therapy needs that you have at different points in a transition. It's so politicized now, and it's interesting because I think people who view things through a very politicized lens with trans issues are, I think, coming with good intentions, but it becomes really unhelpful at a certain point when you're trying to deal with kind of the nitty gritty of your life, your lived life. That's not just a political slogan.
Yeah, and if I could add to that and say, I need more than just affirmation. I need I need down to earth advice and a plan.
I would say, yeah, that's something that I have experienced as well. And I think too that, and I agree, Grace. I think that therapists are coming into this really wanting to do the best for the people that are coming to see them. And I think that a lot of people involved in gender care, whether it's medical or mental health, just based on sort of the data or the lack of data that's there and the political landscape, might have sort of blinders on and think there's only one way for me to help this person. And it's like you were saying, Corinne, it's affirmation. And but it feels so sort of surface level to me. And what I need is, I need someone who's willing to get down in the weeds with me, who's willing to sort of not, be a bigot or, make me feel bad about myself, but who's willing to sort of push me and, really has the expertise and trusts their own expertise enough to do that work with me, instead of relying on me to come in, already having done the work, knowing how I identify, knowing what I need, and just using therapy as a way to access it. Which for me, I would say that that's how therapy functioned. And I can't think of any other condition or life circumstance where therapy is used in that way. And I think it really does a disservice to us and to mental health professionals to say that that they don't have the expertise to really help people, instead of just sort of rubber stamping people or currently functioning in the way that they are.
Yeah, gosh, it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to think about the ways that gender therapists seem to have, I don't know, a set of notes or guidelines that really are like completely different from like therapies for any other sort of topic, in a way that's interesting. And I mean, to build off the therapy talk, I know my experience with with a gender therapist was someone who was I think mostly her main credential and why she like considered herself an expert in the field was sort of because she was ready to be very affirming. And that's something, and that's I don't think therapists should, it's not really a robust, form of therapy, and it doesn't really help people work through the kinds of very real decisions and outcomes that they're trying to decide on, I guess. You know, how do I say this? It's like, what, your identity is, an important and very personal thing to you. And it doesn't need to be a contradiction of your identity or like a challenge to your personhood to recognize also that something like, going on HRT or like going on, like having a surgery or something is something that, it shouldn't be taboo to say like this is something that people will like need help, I guess, making decisions on. And I think therapists should be ideally willing to step up and help with that. I know my experience was very affirmation only from both my doctor and my therapist, who were two people who were required to write me letters for surgery. And not only, it's funny, again, looking back on my medical records, because the sorts of stuff that they wrote, they like wrote things in there that I don't think they took the time to figure out. They were like, Grace has been diagnosed according to like the WPATH standards of care, this kind of thing. And it's like, I really wasn't, which, I will take some, I wish that I had been more diligent about that as well. But I feel like it's a real abdication of responsibility on the part of the providers in some senses too, to sort of rubber stamp people in that way. Yeah.
Well, and it makes me think too about two things. One of which is the way, at least that I see from the outside and as a consumer, the way that expertise has been and is developing in trans medicine. It seems like it's just numbers. It's like you become a gender specialist because you write these letters, or you become a gender specialist because the patients that you see, because you're willing to see these patients, or at least when I came out, how many years ago, like I said with surgery, I was sort of lucky to find somebody who was doing this work. And that I think also ties into the sort of training, or like, it seems to me that sort of there's this mentality of operating sort of at the bare minimum, where it's like having any familiarity with trans issues or finding a therapist who has familiarity with these issues. You're sort of lucky to find that in any way. And so having that affirmation really should be enough. And I think that really speaks to, I believe it was you, Corinne, who was talking about empowering gender care consumers. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so excited about GCCAN, is because I really think that that's what it comes down to, is that, and what's most frustrating to me is that I was, and I see other consumers who were or are sort of willing to accept that bare minimum standard of care and not agitate for more. And we deserve more. We do. We deserve to have providers take responsibility for their role in our care, and we deserve to be healthy. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. I have another question, which I will extend to either of you. What advice would you send back to your younger self about the gender care services that you access? Actually, can I start? This is crazy. Could I start? I actually would like to say this is something I feel kind of passionately about, because I've been really thinking this over lately. I transitioned when I was 22. So I was not a child, but I was also, young, pretty young. I'm now 26, and I have a little more perspective. Probably not that much perspective, but one thing that has been striking to me, and a difference in my attitude back then and now, is that I think when I was starting out, I think that the fact that there were all these professionals who were being really affirming. Like there was doctors, there was therapists, there was surgeons. I mean, there were all these people who were kind of like cheering me on and like, I guess providing. They were all these people involved in my care, and that gave me a sense of security. Like what I was doing was something that was perhaps, I don't know, scientifically rigorous, or like I thought I was sort of, and I know that many trans people would not conceive of their identities like this, but I really conceived of my care as I had this condition that was like gender dysphoria, and I was doing the method that you use to treat it. And it seemed to me that this was like, I was, perhaps I was thinking too literally about it, but I was like, okay, like I'm experiencing gender dysphoria, I fit these symptoms, this is what you do. And there are all these professionals who support this. And I think I remember, my doctor used to like to say, like, no one ever regrets it, which of course, um, you know, um, it's hard to say that with any confidence. And of course, I wish I had been less credulous when I was going through this stuff. But I think if I could go back in time, I would just say, like, hey, like, young Grace, like, you are sort of on your own here. Like, none of your doctors or therapists are, they're kind of just winging it and assuming that you know exactly what you're doing. And I think I was sort of being like, all right, these professionals know what they're doing. So the care I'm receiving is appropriate. Um, and I wish I had been less, I wish I had been less, I wish I had just been a little more skeptical, I guess, because it turns out that people are, yeah, going back to my doctor and being like, hey, this didn't work out for me. And she was just sort of like, well, shoot, that's weird. It usually works. And it's like, I don't know. Now I feel sort of like the doctors and therapists were not really looking out for me in any substantial way at all. So that's what I would tell my former self. Would either of you like to speak to this question?
Well, I have some similar thoughts as you, Grace, that one of the things that I would go back and tell my younger self is, first of all, to try to find, like, to put in the effort, to put in the work it would take to find somebody who was a medical professional who was interested in my actual healthcare, and not just as a drive-through one-time contact point, that is as somebody who has a long-term interest in my care, to try to find that person and build a longer-term relationship with them. Because one of the things that I've lacked on this journey is somebody who is reliable and knowledgeable and who actually knows me. I still don't have a relationship with a general care practitioner who is familiar with my history. The last one that I had unfortunately passed away, and that was not a very long relationship. I think it was like 2 years under that physician's care. But I would go back and tell myself, find somebody who has a reputation for staying in touch with their patients and is interested in their long-term health outcomes.
Yeah, I think I have sort of coming from a similar place as both of your answers. Like I said, I was pretty young when I came out and began the process in gender care. So I think the main thing that I would tell myself is just to slow down. I think everything, when you're 15, everything feels like the end of the world. And I'm about to turn 25 now. And I wish, of course, this is like an impossible task for a 15-year-old, right, to sort of have that self-awareness at that time. But I wish that I could have sort of stepped back from that ledge, and that, because I really had this sense of urgency, which I think should have been a red flag both to me and to everyone involved in my care. But this sort of real sense that if I don't do this, it will be disastrous. And if I had sort of sat with that long enough, I think I may have realized, and with, proper guidance, I think I may have realized that it wasn't necessarily my body that I wanted to change, right? That I was hurting and I needed help. And I think that was my way of sort of trying to get that help. But medicine and surgery weren't the answer. And I also wish, and I'm sure that transgender, not transgender, gender queer consumer, not many teenagers probably feel this way about their parents. I wish that I could have known at the time that my parents' sort of concern for my well-being didn't mean that they were bigots, and it didn't mean that they hate me, and it didn't mean that we were at opposite ends of the sort of political spectrum, and that was a moral position. And I think that their instinct to put the brakes on was a good one. And it came from a place of love. Obviously, I couldn't recognize that at the time, especially in the communities that I was in. I was told that was the ultimate expression, not of love, but of control and of disrespect. So I thought I knew better than them, but I think even if I did wait until I was 18 or 21 or whatever, even if I had decided to transition still at that point and gone on to detransition, I feel like I would have just been in such a better position to be making that decision than I was as a 15-year-old who was really, seriously troubled. So, yeah, I think just sort of slowing down. But again, I know that's just impossible when you're 15, when you're a teenager.
Well, Grace, I think part of it is that, and both in my case and your case and also Grace Ladinsky Smith, like what sort of role models did we have when we were young? It's even more exacerbated now, but there are a lot of people who, and this was even true in the 90s, there are a lot of people who glamorize outcomes, and people who have struggles as a result of care that they've received are either labeled as being non-typical cases, or that they should never have tried in the first place. There's always some sort of excuse. But I think one of the things that would help our younger selves slow down is if we could at least know about or even be in touch with somebody who would be willing to talk about their experiences like we are now, so that we could hear that there's other paths forward, and that they're all right, and that you can still survive them.
Well, and I think too that there's this real, and certainly I felt this drive, this sort of political exigency to present that very positive narrative, to say it did work for me, and this is why we need to be able to access treatment. And so sort of hiding or covering up any either unhappiness with the outcome or complications. And yeah, I think there's this idea that honest representations, particularly when they don't go sort of as according to plan, are dangerous. But I think that is probably the most helpful thing. If I had been able to see that, if I had had someone, if I had seen something like this where people were being sort of honest about the fact that their doctors didn't care, or that they didn't really know enough to make that decision at the time, or that they did make that decision and it didn't work out, or it did work out, but they need better. So I think that, this is the kind of work, I guess, that needs to be getting done.
Yeah, I think that's something that I hope GCCAN can fulfill as like a role of trying to provide representation of just the realistic complexities of going through transgender healthcare, and hopefully we can encourage both just in the in the community of people who are involved in this sort of thing to just be less afraid to talk about less than ideal outcomes, just because people are going to be dealing with them whether or not we talk about it, and it's not doing anyone any favors to pretend that it doesn't happen. People are better prepared to understand what they're getting into if they are aware of this sort of thing. And I think providers have a role to play here too, with I don't know, it'd be interesting to imagine if gender health care was encouraged to provide, like Corinna, like you said, encouraged to provide sort of long-term continuity of care plans for people. And I imagine that could also include like some resources like that people would know would be available if they desisted or detransitioned as well for the sorts of things like whether it's like switching your hormones or coming off of HRT, like this sort of thing. I think for me, just like maybe having that be something that a doctor would like go over with me could be very powerful and like a helpful thing to hear from someone in a position of authority, but also just helpful for people to for this kind of thing to be destigmatized to talk about. Um, so we have about 10 minutes left. I had another question that I wanted us all to talk about, but I also wanted to invite, if anyone in the chat wants to ask any questions, please feel free to drop them in there. We're monitoring it and we will answer them if they come in. And let's see, was there anything else that we needed to? Oh yeah, and then I'll say a couple more things about GCCAN at the end. So I guess we'll see if anyone has any questions, but in the meantime, I'd like to ask one more question of the two of you, which is if you could change one thing about how gender care services are provided, what would it be?
Corinna, do you have anything, or I can go?
Yeah, I've got a really small one. So there aren't a lot of people, like, in respect to the general population, there are not a lot of us who are gender care consumers. Therefore, I think providers should be doing more to track our outcomes and to try to coordinate that. There should be more research into our health outcomes. Just like a small example of this is, as I'm getting into my middle age now, I know that I have to start taking care of like my heart more. As a male to female transsexual who's on estrogen, like what specifically do I need to be aware of? And I really doubt that there's even been any research that could answer that question for me. So one of the things that I would change is better research and monitoring of health outcomes for gender care consumers.
Yeah, I think that mine probably connects to that. Mine is more of a, I guess, idealistic or macro level suggestion for providers. And I think it ties in, like all of our conversation was looping back with itself, but ties into what we've been talking about. What I really want is for our lives and our well-being to have value for providers. Because I think that that's something that's really missing from care. And in my experience, and maybe I'm just being too cynical, but in my experience, I feel like all I've been is a dollar sign to these people. Because these are mostly elective procedures. At least when I was having them done, they weren't covered by insurance. And because there were so few people doing it, especially surgery, they were able to say, well, I'm the only one doing this, so you come here and you pay me, X amount of money, and then you're out the door. And so I think it, ties in very nicely with what you're saying, Corinna, about really having some sort of level of respect for our well-being over the course of our lives. And it reminds me, I forget who said this or where I heard this from, but someone said that they'd been talking with one of their friends about this lack of data collection and sort of experimental nature of trans medicine, and they expressed, I feel like a guinea pig. I feel like a sort of a lab rat. And the response that their friend told them was, well, if we were guinea pigs, they would at least be collecting data, and they're not. And so, I think that really speaks to sort of the level of disrespect is what it feels like that people have for gender care consumers and our health. And that's where I see GCCAN really being a potential stepping stone to us empowering ourselves and empowering all other consumers to really fight for what we deserve.
Well said.
Indeed, well said. Yeah, I think feeling like tokenized and almost like condescended to, honestly, by this sort of like head patting, move along kind of treatment that at least I feel like I got is like really doesn't feel like a favor coming from someone who's like a medical professional, I'll say. Um, I don't know. Sometimes, yeah, sometimes it can feel like doctors feel are like seem like they're like doing us a favor or something by providing this very like perfunctory care. But yeah, it's not uh, it's not helpful to people not to not be really like digging in and like caring about long term outcomes. I guess I will say again. I would also, along the same lines, I would just love for this issue to be able to separate politically charged ideology from the actual kind of healthcare. I don't know. I guess like old school healthcare outcomes, like things that you would care about in other sorts of procedures. I would like people to not consider it taboo to talk about that because it does us a real disservice. I think it's not fair to assume that everyone will end up with the same outcome when they come to a gender therapist or a doctor. And I think that we should be able to have different treatments for gender dysphoria and be able to pick what works best for us instead of being railroaded down one path. I know with my top surgery, or I should say, I guess top surgery, my double mastectomy is what it was, is I really did feel like just like a dollar sign, like Grace says, for my surgeon. They're very persistent about getting me booked as soon as possible, and they had this Instagram where they like showed off the all the surgery results from everyone, and like we're posting all these memes about being your true self and stuff, and it was just like it's kind of a confusing thing to be involved in because it's like marketed like plastic surgery. It's marketed in the way that like plastic surgery is marketed, but then has this sort of veneer of being like I guess standard medical treatment. It's confusing. It's strange. It feels like there's some dissonance there in between. I don't know, it being a procedure that's supposed to treat a condition, but then it's marketed like I don't know. It's very strange.
It's almost trying to figure out the right word. I don't think religious is the right word, but there's almost like a spiritual, a promise of spiritual completion.
There is,
in the marketing,
I think,
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to say this will complete you. This will make you who you truly are and who you are meant to be.
Yeah,
which is it's a heady thing, especially when you're young and you don't have all the info.
Yeah, it's a heady thing.
One thing that I would change then is I would say that you shouldn't be allowed to market to people to say that
shouldn't be able to have an Instagram.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of. I know when I came back to my doctor, I had kind of a feeling of being like, hey, like you said this would be like this sort of like transformative experience that would make my like mental health so much better, but like I just feel like me, but I just had this really intense surgery that's like really upsetting me now. So like, yeah, I feel like I don't know, it feels sort of like a switcheroo or something. It's very weird. It's a weird thing to go through. So yeah, I think that's did either of you have any last notes you wanted to add?
I'm excited about GCCAN. I believe in the mission. I want more people to sign on. I think we could really make some much needed changes for the way things are working right now, or not working.
Yeah.
I'd like to also extend for anybody who's watching this now or in the future, if you see yourself in any of us and you think that you deserve better outcomes or better treatment, doesn't matter who you are. If you're a gender care consumer, then we have common cause, because we all should be able to demand better treatment and better outcome, better long-term tracking of research. We all deserve it. Doesn't matter who you are.
Yes. So I guess one last little thing at the end. So if you, like Corinna said, if you see us and if you see yourself in any of these stories, if you have been a gender care consumer and you're interested in getting involved with GCCAN, you can email at media@gccan.org, or you can go to our website and fill out the contact form if you want to be involved in any way. We've had there are opportunities for, you could be interviewed for our blog or get involved with the board. Really, we're really open to collaborating with new people. So we'd like to invite that to anyone who has these experiences. So thank you all so much for showing up. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I think we really will have it well for next time. So, all right. Thank you all, and GCCAN signing off.